Hey, y'all, welcome to the virtual report launch for investing in pretrial justice in Illinois, a vision for supporting communities after the end of Money Bond. My name is Matt McLaughlin. I'm an organizer with the Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice. We are a statewide coalition of more than 45 community, faith, legal, and policy organizations that have been working together for nearly a decade now to make Illinois the first state in the country to completely end the use of money bond, which we did in September of last year. And we're here tonight to talk to you about our new report and the next steps for our movement. We're going to have a short presentation that's going to give a little bit of an overview of what's in the report, which came out today, followed by a breakdown on the Pretrial Success Act, a piece of legislation that we are currently pushing for in Springfield to get resources for people who are awaiting trial. And then we're going to wrap this thing up with a great discussion with some service providers and advocates about the fight for pretrial justice and pretrial funding in Illinois. And without further ado, I am going to bring on Brianna Payton, who's going to walk us through this report. I'll hand it over to you, Brianna.
Thank you so much, Matt. Good evening, everybody. My name is Brianna Payton. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Chicago Appleseed Center for Fair Courts, and we are a proud member of the Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice. So we are going to go over the report about investing in pretrial justice in Illinois because We have a vision for supporting communities after the Pretrial Fairness Act that extends beyond just the removal of money bond from our pretrial system. But first, just so we're all on the same page, even though I'm sure we are, we're going to start with the critical context of the Pretrial Fairness Act. So as most people know, the Pretrial Fairness Act is monumental legislation that has made Illinois the first state in the country to completely abolish money bond. And as we revel in the history that we are in the midst of making, it is critical that we do not lose sight of what has driven us to push for this reform to begin with. This legislation was passed because Illinois residents are worthy of a system that takes their well-being and equal access to justice seriously. It was passed because the presumption of innocence should not have a price tag, and because communities have a greater chance at thriving when we don't allow wealth-based jailing to snatch people from their families, jobs, and dreams. So far, this policy has begun to have a positive impact, driving down the level of pretrial incarceration in our state and ensuring that no one is locked up due to their access to cash. But our vision is not yet fulfilled. We must respond to the need to not only undo the harms caused by wealth-based jailing, but invest the resources into our communities that disrupt cycles of trauma, violence, and incarceration. This is the mandate that undergirds our vision for pretrial spending in Illinois. Now I want to turn our attention to the principles that we hope will guide the allocation of resources amidst our state's strengthened commitment to pretrial fairness. So, the first principle that is central to our work and to our vision for pretrial funding in Illinois is equity. State spending in response to the Pretrial Fairness Act should prioritize communities that were the most burdened by the money bond system and pretrial jailing. The next principle is non-coercion, because people awaiting trial are legally presumed innocent and should not be coerced into participating in services, including but not limited to substance use treatment, mental health treatment, and supports designed to facilitate court appearance. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Community engagement is another really important principle, because services should be continually informed by community members, including those who have been directly impacted by the criminal legal system, and delivered by organizations that are trusted within the community. Coordination is key because we believe that the pretrial court system and related services should be easy to navigate and avoid the creation of new bureaucratic barriers to success during the pretrial period. We center community wellness because we believe that the development and maintenance of community wellness services should be an integral part of the funding priorities, including direct budget increases and more grant funding for the Department of Human Services and community-based organizations and other health and wellness initiatives across the state and local governments. And lastly, community reinvestment is central to our vision, because any cost saved by a decrease in the number of people incarcerated awaiting trial following the implementation of the Pretrial Fairness Act should be invested in communities whose wealth was historically extracted by the money bond system, and not into institutions that perpetuate cycles of incarceration. Next slide, please. So we cannot talk about pretrial spending following the Pretrial Fairness Act implementation without centering the critical importance of funding public defense. Just as the Pretrial Fairness Act ensures the right to access to equal justice even if you can't access wealth, public defense for people who cannot pay for an attorney ensures the same. There have been landmark legal cases that have codified the right of every person to an attorney, fair representation, and quality representation. And it's no secret that unmanageable caseloads and limited resources directly and severely interfere with quality of defense and outcomes for people who are accused and navigating legal cases. A 2020 study from the University of Illinois at Chicago's Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy found that in Illinois counties where public defenders have larger caseloads, more people are jailed awaiting trial than in counties whose public defenders have smaller caseloads. Go figure. So the Pretrial Fairness Act increases the need for quality public defense, as it has done away with brief hearings where judges arbitrarily choose a monetary amount to determine pretrial release. And it's ushered in hearings that are longer and more robust, more rigorous, and they require more rigorous engagement with evidence and more preparation for the hearings. This amounts to more work for defense attorneys, but this is not a bad thing. This is an opportunity for people to receive the quality of defense and the rigor and fairness in hearings that they should always have been entitled to under the law. And it is up to us and our state to meet the mandate and provide the resources that can allow attorneys to make the rights that were enshrined in the Pretrial Fairness Act a reality for accused people across Illinois. Now, the status of how things have been with public defense in Illinois prior to the implementation of the Pretrial Fairness Act did not set us up for success in this area. In counties across the state, public defenders have been and continue to be funded at a fraction of the amount given to prosecutor's office, not uncommonly at a ratio of 1 to 2 in Cook County and in others. While there was funding released last year with the implementation of the Pretrial Fairness Act, $10 million of funding to bolster public defense across the state, it was permitted to be used for other expenditures besides attorneys, and some counties were hesitant to use it to hire due to no promise of renewed funding. Sustained funding for public defense in Illinois is a non-negotiable need following the Pretrial Fairness Act and even prior to it. Without the adequate resourcing of public defense in Illinois, it is safe to say that the rights enshrined by statute in the Pretrial Fairness Act will be unable to benefit the real people they're meant to protect in courtrooms across the state. Next slide. So next, we're going to talk about funding other supports that make success in the pretrial stage more likely, especially those that promote court appearance. Despite the common knee-jerk reaction to punish failure to appear in our pretrial system, missing court is often not intentional. People miss court for all sorts of reasons, from not knowing or remembering that they had a court date to difficulty obtaining transportation or childcare or leave from work. Some of these barriers have very straightforward solutions in terms of services that can mitigate them, and court reminders is an obvious one. Text, phone, and even postcard reminders have all proven effective at lowering missed court dates in jurisdictions across the country. And live phone call reminders have even mitigated racial disparities in failure to appear. Investing in reminders can save counties $20 to $50 for each court appearance that is prevented, amounting to thousands of dollars saved annually. Other barriers like transportation and childcare can also be alleviated with targeted support. Illinois lacks public transit in many locales, and Illinoisans face some of the longest commuting times in the country. Evidence shows that transportation subsidies can increase court appearance rates even in places where people lack transit options. These simple but effective solutions can help people avoid the web of escalating pretrial punishment due to missed court dates and reap an incredible return on investment by less incarceration and more stable communities. So we can go to the next slide. Next, we're going to talk about voluntary services. These investments that increase our chances at keeping people in their communities that we're discussing are only bolstered even more when communities are equipped with robust access to voluntary services. It's critical that mental and behavioral health care, substance use treatment, and other treatment is accessible in our local communities, and that they're not delivered and administered through the means of incarceration. This is because proper treatment does not occur in a cage. This is not just a mantra, but a reality that bears itself out again and again when you look at the statistics and outcomes of people that are dealing with substance use as well as incarceration. Drug overdose is the leading cause of death following release from prison. People within 2 weeks of their release from custody are 129 times more likely to die of overdose than the general population. People who were previously incarcerated are 62% more likely to die by suicide than the general public, which speaks to the harm that incarceration has on people's mental health. And among people incarcerated in Illinois prisons, only an estimated 17% of those in need of clinical treatment service actually receive them during their time of incarceration. These are all the more reasons why we need to invest in voluntary services that are accessible within our local communities. That is where people can be connected to supportive relationships and the other things that allow them to build a stable life while tending to their behavioral, mental health, and other needs. So we can go to the next slide. Cost savings and community reinvestment are central to our vision for how pretrial spending is conducted following the implementation of the Pretrial Fairness Act. Between 2016 and 2020, Illinois collected more than $700 million in money bonds. Only 20% of that money was ever returned to community members who paid it. The decades-long practice of wealth-based jailing has truly ravaged our communities, and there is a duty to engage in the work not only to discontinue this injustice, which we are doing, but also to repair it. Community reinvestment is the opportunity to begin to right the wrongs and disrupt cycles of trauma, violence, criminalization, and incarceration. And this can be done by increasing funding for community-based care and directing cost savings into investments back into our communities. We can go to the next slide. As we invest in safe and thriving communities, it is critical that we do so with an intentional eye towards avoiding the mistakes of the past. We have seen what it looks like when we pour billions and millions of dollars into institutions that only cause failed outcomes and continued cycles of violence and harm and trauma. And so we need to take the resources and put them back where they belong, which is in our communities and into the families that have been separated by wealth-based incarceration, into the people that have been robbed of economic opportunity due to pretrial incarceration, and so on and so forth. The importance of trust cannot be overstated. So as we look at where and through whom services should be delivered, we should be looking to properly trained community-based providers, social workers, violence intervention outreach workers, medical workers, and more that are all based in the community. It's important that we're not funneling services through professional entities that have been found to have broken down trust relationships with communities and that have been found to be related to causing harm to community members, especially Black, Brown, and poor community members. Again, in order to help people without causing further harm, it is so critical that we are investing in services that people can access in community-based care rather than in jails. As we invest in these resources and redirect them from the cycles of harm and incarceration, we can begin and continue the work of healing together from wealth-based jailing and thriving beyond our wildest dreams. Thank you. I'll pass it also over to Becky. Sorry, forgot about transitioning. I'll pass it to Becky Levin, who's going to go over the Pretrial Act.
Thanks, Brianna. I'm Becky Levin. I work at TASC, Treatment Alternatives for Safe Communities. Really happy to be here to talk about the Pretrial Success Act. Following the Pretrial Fairness Act, this is a policy that really focuses on investing in the supports and services that will allow us to make communities safer. Next slide. And I'm realizing my slides are too small on my screen for me to see them. So now that the Pretrial Fairness Act ensures that pretrial release isn't determined by who has access to money, it's determined by safety and justice, we're able to make sure that more people can keep their jobs, housing, and their connections to loved ones while they're awaiting trial in the community. Now, the Pretrial Success Act is really intended to set them up to thrive by expanding access to supports and services that can help them during that pretrial period. Next slide. So the vision is that we can reduce pretrial jailing and improve community safety at the same time by expanding access to case management, mental health care, substance use disorder for people who are awaiting trial. Essentially, we'll reduce pretrial jailing and improve community safety by interrupting the cycle of people coming in and out of jail, in and out of incarceration, by getting them connected to the supports and services that they need. So the Pretrial Success Act is a funding request for $15 million from the state of Illinois. The funding would create a community-based network of care through a statewide grant program that we're calling for to be administered by the Illinois Department of Human Services. We very intentionally are proposing to have this grant program administered through the Department of Human Services because this is a health and human services program. Next slide. So there are several types of services that will be funded through the Pretrial Success Act. The first is system navigation, right? So being involved in the criminal legal system, a lot of folks are also involved in other complex systems, have other complexity and challenges in life. And so just being able to navigate those systems, having someone to walk hand in hand and provide support in navigating those systems. The Pretrial Success Act would fund mental health and substance use disorder services, including case management, assessment, and treatment, all according to clinical standards. This is very important to us that it not be a judge or a prosecutor making a decision about what mental health or substance use disorder services someone should be receiving. And the Pretrial Success Act will also fund transportation and childcare to facilitate access to court appearance. Next slide. The Pretrial Success Act is founded on a set of 4 values that really mirror what Brianna talked about in the report. So first is equity, right? Money bond extracted so much wealth from communities, especially Black and Brown communities. One of the goals of the Pretrial Success Act is to very intentionally prioritize investments in those communities that were hit the hardest by money bond, and really intentionally invest in supports and services in those communities. Services funded by the Pretrial Success Act will be required to be voluntary. In general, voluntary services work far better than services that are mandated by a court system or coerced in some way. It allows for better engagement. It allows for someone to be participating because they really want to. And so that's an important value of the Pretrial Success Act. The third value is community voice. Illinois is a very big state. The community needs in Chicago look far different from the community needs in a rural community in central or southern Illinois. So we really want to ensure that there's the voice of the local community in shaping how the funds are spent in that community. That community voice will include people with lived experience, individuals who have themselves gone through having been charged with a felony, and folks who have loved ones who've been charged with a felony. So essentially people who know what pretrial looks like. And part of this community voice is also to make sure that funding is going to the organizations that are trusted in a community, that are really the credible, well-respected organizations in a community, not just, an outside nonprofit behemoth kind of helicoptering into a community to snatch up grant dollars. And the last is coordination. Like I said earlier, folks are already navigating so many complex systems. The last thing we want to do is add another complicated bureaucracy that individuals who are awaiting trial have to navigate. So the goal will really be to coordinate with other systems and to coordinate across the state in delivery of these services. Next slide. And so now we'd love you to join us in taking action and telling your legislators to support the Pretrial Success Act. So you can get this QR code here, or Matt is going to provide a link. This is going to take you to an action tool so that you can contact your own state representative and state senator to tell them to support the Pretrial Success Act. And so we're going to pause here for a minute and give you a chance to go ahead and take action with us. And I think we're going to transition to our panel now. So I'm so happy to be joined by 3 fabulous people who, one of my favorite things about getting to be part of Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice is getting to work with folks like them. So you've already met Brianna Payton, the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Chicago Appleseed Center for Fair Courts and Chicago Council of Lawyers. And we're joined by Lauren Wright, who is the Executive Director of Illinois Partners for Human Service, and Stephanie Coleman, who's the Policy Director at the Children and Family Justice Center at the Bloom Legal Clinic at Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. So we're going to have a little discussion about the report, about implementation of the Pretrial Fairness Act, about what pretrial justice looks like in Illinois. So I'm going to start with a question for Brianna. So, I just talked about the Pretrial Success Act. So pretrial success sounds really nice. What does that actually mean?
Absolutely. So pretrial success has layers to it, right? When the Pretrial Fairness Act is having its intended effect, that means that fewer people are being subjected to pretrial jailing. Nobody is being subjected to it based on wealth. Nobody is being subjected to it, especially in the absence of any threat to another person. But it's also more than that. Even when people are released before trial, the real goal should not just be succeeding by, abiding by all of the requirements of the case or the court system. Of course, we want there to be compliance, but we really want people to be able to get disentangled from the legal system. We want people to be able to build lives where they are thriving and moving towards goals and not actually wrapped up in a cycle of continued involvement in the legal system. And so that requires getting to root causes, right? That requires that where there are needs that are not being met, that are contributing to repeated contact with this system, that there is some form of community support that people are able to access to help them to pivot in a direction that takes them away from, these systems that we know drive outcomes of poor mental health, shattered family relationships, worse economic outcomes. The further that we can get people away from the cycles that drive those things, and the more that we can get them into support that allows them to build the lives that they actually desire, the better off that we'll be, and the more that we'll be actually realizing pretrial success.
That sounds great. So, Lauren, you're the executive director of Illinois Partners for Human Service. I don't think we can get to the vision that Brianna just described without our human services providers. So maybe can you tell us what pretrial success means to you?
From a perspective of human services, I would say deeper and more robust investment in those community supports that Brianna has been talking about. We know that people who have interacted with the justice system, they're not going to be able to access the same kind of support as someone with fewer barriers. It's inevitable that those systems cause barriers to accessing the type of care that people need, and their needs are not linear. They're not just one thing. It's not binary. And I think having a robust and well-invested human service system that is rooted in community, that is rooted in community-based services is the only way that we will actually have pretrial fairness truly implemented and pretrial success in our communities.
Great, thank you. So, Lauren, you talked about investment in services. So let's go there. The Pretrial Success Act calls for a $15 million investment in pretrial supports and services. Is that enough? Is that going to meet all the need?
The short answer is no, that is not enough. And especially when you consider the sheer amount of money that has been extracted from Black and Brown communities through the money bond system. But regardless of that, this is an incredibly modest request, and there's absolutely no reason why this level of investment should not be supported by all of our legislators, by our state administration, our current administration, and by the Department of Human Services as well. And as I was talking about, when you actually want people to succeed and you want to see them access services that they're going to be able to utilize and contribute to their overall well-being, those services have to be invested in community. But those services are also a lot less costly in the end than investing in our carceral systems. And so this is an incredibly modest investment, but there's so much more to do to invest in a robust community-based human service network. And but there's no excuse that anyone could give me as to why they wouldn't be able to invest this $15 million to begin to show success for pretrial fairness.
And just to be clear, even though it's a modest investment, you do still think it's going to make a difference, right?
Absolutely. No, and I don't want to minimize that. It absolutely will make a difference. But it's still a drop in the bucket. And I think we often come up against, at least in human services, and the reason why I'm emphasizing this, just to be clear, is that we're often pitted against each other for scarce resources in this sector. And I really want to eliminate that narrative here, that this is vital, this is important. It will do so much for our communities and for the folks that need it most. And I don't like to give into the idea that the resources are scarce and we have to be fighting against each other for those investments. I reject that notion wholeheartedly. So that's really where my perspective comes from.
Great, thanks. So Brianna, this next question, I'm going to start with you. Some people would argue that if someone is arrested with drugs or because they're having a mental health crisis, that they should be mandated to get treatment. So aside from the fact that pre-trial, we're talking about someone who's actually presumed innocent, you know, what are the downsides to mandating treatment?
Yeah, so in a similar way that the statistics really bear out that treatment is not successful when it's happening in a cage and in jails, the statistics continue to bear out that treatment is most effective when it's voluntarily engaged. When you try to force someone into doing something that they're not ready and have come onto their own terms with doing, you don't often get the outcomes that you are probably hoping for. And so it's really important that people are being offered the opportunity to voluntarily access services and not having their arms twisted into it. And I know you said it's aside from the fact that people are before trial and is presumed innocent, but I think that it does bear naming that is an important part of the equation here, that we are dealing with people that are accused. We are not dealing with people that are convicted. You're not dealing with facts that have even been confirmed beyond clear and convincing evidence and all those different standards that come in through the process of a legal case. And so mandating someone to certain things before they've even had their full days in court, it's not a fair way to engage with people who are supposed to be having a limit on how much their liberty is being infringed upon at the stage that they're in the legal process.
Great, thank you. So Stephanie, let's add some legal perspective here. What are the downsides to mandating treatment?
Well, I think Brianna did a great job of queuing that up, which is that when people are ordered into treatment, that is the sort of thing that accompanies a sentencing order, right? Ordinarily, and that is the type of thing that happens after you've been found guilty. Now, because of what she said about the efficacy of treatment that isn't voluntary, I think it's probably better for most people to be opting into treatment and then continuing that treatment throughout the disposition of their case on a voluntary basis. But that said, when the state is requiring people to participate in treatment, that means that not participating in treatment carries a consequence. And when you have a consequence that is attached to whatever could be happening with you, whether it's difficulties getting to the treatment, just difficulty understanding when and where, especially, people who are facing really hard personal times, this is a lot to track. It's a lot of complication. And what often happens is that they can be returned back into custody, not because they've been accused of committing a new offense, but simply because they aren't abiding by a pretrial release condition. And that's certainly not, if they're struggling to keep up with things on the outside, that doesn't make them a danger to the community. It doesn't make them a person who shouldn't be free waiting trial. It just means that they need extra support in order to participate in programs or services. And so it's really important that we aren't putting people in a cell, further exacerbating trauma and things that exacerbate substance abuse because they're having a hard time getting connected to services.
Right. So since the services provided under the Pretrial Success Act would be voluntary, Lauren, as the representative of the human services sector, do we think that people are going to use the services? How do we make sure that they use them?
I think the idea that people won't utilize voluntary services it's rooted in the same ideas around our carceral systems and belief that coercion is the only way that people are going to better their lives. And I think when we look at people who interact with the justice system and the types of services they need, a trauma-informed case manager who can understand the breadth and depth of the challenges that they're facing and connect them with the right community resources so they can actually begin to improve and rebuild their lives. This is done through voluntary services. You're only able to really show that kind of impact when people are met with empathy and they're met with someone who's willing to understand what they're going through and who doesn't see them as a single issue person. We know that the needs are complex, and we know that those who are in need of these types of services need access to the kind of trauma-informed and empathetic case management that we know community-based human service providers, when they are invested in and when they have those resources, that they can really provide.
Great. Thanks so much. So I'm going to pivot us a little bit, and now we're going to talk a bit about the need for investment in the public defense system. So, Stephanie, even prior to implementation of the Pretrial Fairness Act, the public defenders across the state, their capacity was stretched thin. So how has the Pretrial Fairness Act increased the need for greater investment in public defense?
Well, yes. Prior to the PFA, it was a crisis. I think there's been several reviews of the state of public defense in Illinois, really characterizing that word as appropriate to the nature of how deeply we have not invested in public defense, and also some of the structures that we have around it. But the additional impact posed by the Pretrial Fairness Act, because it also did come with some supplemental funds, I think there was some ability to absorb cases, although the way that those funds came in, the way that they were administered, didn't always allow county public defender offices to hire additional personnel to perform additional duties under the PFA. When release hearings are happening, it is, they're much more robust than they used to be, which is good. And that does put burden, though, on public defenders who are already carrying caseloads, and in many cases that are 2 or 3 times the national recommended level. And so it's really important that when we're looking at how to make the Pretrial Fairness Act real, we can be finding ways to make sure that people have full advocacy power sitting alongside them in the courtroom. And when public defenders are under-resourced, then that's difficult to manage.
Thanks. So, Brianna, what is the impact of the quality of defense on people awaiting trial?
Yeah, absolutely. So our coalition has worked with countless people who are navigating the legal system while awaiting trial. And we've seen the difference in cases where there is an attorney who has the resources to give the case the time and attention that it needs and deserves, versus when an attorney is triaging an overloaded set of cases due to limited time, limited funding for their office, limited numbers of attorneys that are being put on the cases that need public defense. When I worked at the Chicago Community Bond Fund, which has previously paid bond for people that couldn't afford it, we would see how sometimes people would prefer or feel like they were down and out if they couldn't afford to pay for a private attorney over a public defender, because the public defenders were stretched thin. And it's not because there are not amazing public defenders who are incredibly dedicated to their jobs and the people that they serve, but it's that they're not being given the same amount of resources that are really needed to sometimes serve people in the way that people desire to be served in cases that have such high stakes for their lives. It's absolutely not always the case that a private attorney is going to give you a better outcome than a public defense attorney, but there is this stigma that exists because of the fact that people are so used to seeing public defenders that are overloaded with more cases than what they should be reasonably asked to do, and then compromise in their ability to give the service and the representation and the zealous representation that they want and that people actually need, so that they can safeguard their freedom in these cases with such high stakes.
And Stephanie, what are some of the challenges associated with funding public defense?
There are a lot. Our structure in Illinois is sort of uniquely struggling, I think. Most states have some hybrid system of state and county funding. Some states have a state-funded system. In Illinois, our public defense system is not necessarily a system, and it is primarily funded by county property taxes. And if you think about that for a minute, you can see how communities where the property tax base is low because they don't have a lot of money in that community, and therefore they require additional public defense resources, maybe. This is a spiraling problem, right? There's fewer tax dollars coming in to spend on the courts in general. Public defense gets a smaller share of that, but the need is greater because the community is lower income. And so it's really important that we have a way to adjust for equity as a result of the funding system that we have. Funding is not the only structural issue with how resources are happening and how they may not be getting to people, but the county-based funding system that we have is really driving a lot of inequities in representation. Although, so in my office, Julie Beal and other people who in the law school teamed up with people in the sociology school and did a review of funding and resources and caseloads around the state and compared them. And in that comparison, every single county in Illinois needs more public defense resources. They need attorneys. They also need investigators, mental health workers, social workers, staff support. In many cases, they need offices. They need pens and paper. They need access to Westlaw. The need is unbelievable, especially once you get outside of Cook and the Collier counties. But although every single county needed more resources, there still were a lot of disparities in how many more, right? And rural Illinoisans in particular, and obviously Black and Latino defendants also, are disproportionately, because those latter groups are targeted by the system and are overrepresented in the system, they are most vulnerable when it comes to underfunded systems. And in rural areas, a lot of the problems that I described, the tax base sometimes applies, but also with whether there's even attorneys who are living in that community that can come and work on contracts. In counties under 35,000 people in Illinois, there isn't a requirement to have a county public defender. And so there are judicially appointed contracted private attorneys to perform public defense services. And the gaps that can leave are, especially when the contracted money is so low, really leave a lot to be desired in what people have access to. So in order to make sure that communities and clients get good representation, we obviously need to increase the size of the pie going to defense, but we also need to adjust it so that there is state money flowing in, and there is also state supervision of where the resources are going and where the needs really lie.
Great, thank you. So I know that legislation has been filed to create a statewide public defense system. Stephanie, what should community members, advocates, non-lawyers like me be looking for in that system?
So what has been filed so far is a proposal for an Office of Public Defense Support that is underneath the Administrative Office of the Illinois Court and is primarily a planning tool for getting Illinois farther toward a system. The sponsor of that legislation, Senate President Harmon, has said that he really wants to negotiate with community members, advocates, the defense community in general, to make sure that it's something that can help to achieve equity goals around the state. And that's really heartening, because what we really need is structure and momentum right now to get us faster toward a place where people's rights can be really made real in the courtroom. When you think about what's lacking, it's just incredible to contemplate, right? And on the one side of the courtroom, the prosecutors coming in with the resources of tens of thousands of law enforcement around the state. And on the other side of the courtroom, all of the public defenders in the state put together have fewer investigators to counterbalance these tens of thousands of law enforcement officers. than just the Cook County State's Attorney's Office has, right? So when we're thinking about, and that's just investigation, there are many other things that go into a case. And when you think about what communities really deserve to have in public defense services, things like the ability to participate in their loved one's defense in a meaningful way, to get timely updates about what's happening, to be really intimately involved in the ability to testify, especially at those release hearings that are so important at the very beginning. And now that they're robust, there should be a chance to do that. But that really means getting a hold of people who have maybe unreliable access to communication and making sure that they know when and where to come to court, that they know that they can have some of their concerns addressed. Because sometimes when people are arrested, there's family friction, right? And so the ability of a social worker to help smooth some of those things out really can be key in that moment. So advocates have been talking to defenders, and we at the Children and Family Justice Center have drafted model legislation that we're referring to as the FAIR Act, which is Funded and Accessible Independent Representation, is the acronym for FAIR. So what we hope that will what the legislation is intended to do, and what we'd like to bring to a negotiating table, really is setting up an office of the statewide public defender that has real resources, has independence from the judiciary, which is a recommendation by the American Bar Association and every other organization that has looked at this and is in the legal profession. And I won't bore you all with the details on that today, except to say that currently, in 101 of Illinois' 102 counties, a judge can decide without cause or really much notice that a chief public defender is going to be removed and replaced. And what that does is holds out a very real threat of removal for attorneys who want to speak out about court conditions. If they want to say, my caseload is so heavy, I worry I'm not able to meet my constitutional obligations to this client, or my ethical obligations to this client's constitutional rights, right? If they want to say that, they really run the risk of losing their job or their boss's job. And so you can imagine that this is a very difficult thing for courts to want in the press about the way that their courts are being run. And so there's just a natural conflict of interest. This is not an Illinois specific problem in the sense that this is why the national organizations have said judges should not be in charge of public defense, and they should not be appointing public defenders. It's just a rule conflict of interest. Prosecutors come into the courtroom and advocate for their side without any fear of judicial interference, and public defenders need to be able to do the same, or else people's rights may not be fully advocated for in the way that we all need them to be. So that is a key part. I know that's a very technical and complicated part of what we're asking for, but that is half of the balance of the FAIR Act, right? One is funding the advocacy, and one is independent representation, and both of those are really key to have in the near term, so that we can start getting Illinois back on the path of better, broader access to all of the promises that we all want to be made real in the Safety Act and the Pretrial Fairness Act.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. So I realize that all four of us have, I think, used the word equity or equitable several times. So I was just going to take us on a little tangent for a minute and ask us each to define equity, or describe what we mean by equity. So Lauren, why don't we start with you? When you're thinking about human services, what does the word equity mean?
I think equity, and I want to fully acknowledge that equity, particularly in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, has become like a real buzzword that a lot of people throw around without really analyzing the deeper meaning and what does it actually look like. And I think for human services in particular, there's probably a stronger need to turn the mirror on ourselves a little bit and look at the ways in which we, whether it's intentional or not, have contributed to these systems that and inequitable societal structures that have encouraged some of the things that we're trying to rectify today. So when I think about equity, I actually think more about what is my responsibility to undo structural inequities that are baked into the way that our society at large, but human services, in my case, human services in particular, has been operating without having to really critically look at ourselves. And I think that's why when we talk about equity, we have to talk about community and community-based services, because that's unique and it meets the needs of people where they are. But ultimately for me, when I think about equity, it's more around what is my individual and our structural responsibility to undo inequitable systems.
Great. Thanks. And Stephanie, how about when it comes to our legal system and public defense specifically, what does equity mean?
Well, it's hard to describe for me, I think, equity in the context of criminal trials in particular. The government is massive and individuals are standing there alone next to a lawyer. And I think equity between people who are brought before the court, finding some way that I think Brian Stevens says, making sure that everybody gets the rich man's justice, right? The process afforded to rich white men. I think that's an important idea to hold when we're talking about what defense should look like. But it really starts outside of the courtroom, right? Because people are being brought into this system in extremely inequitable ways. And really, access to that attorney is the first point that they have anyone who is standing next to them. Prior to that point, inequities in community are leading to inequities in harm. They're also leading to inequities in police resources and how those are being aimed in especially geographic areas, and targeting people by race. And so I think when we're talking about how to start unwinding all of the inequities that people are carrying with them into the courtroom at that beginning of the hearing, a lawyer is an important feature to help. But I don't think anybody can rightly say that fixes it or really even begins to do much other than cause the system that is really carrying along and swept along by sort of these compounding inequities to stop and pause and consider the person and their reality and their rights and their future and their potential and what they offer the community. I don't know that we can hope for more in that moment. And so I wouldn't want to characterize that as equitable necessarily. But I do think that it's important that, standards of a modern defense for people with money, we can see in our entertainment all the time, right? We see people having access to forensics experts and jury consultants and a whole wide range of, all of the footage that's being reviewed from extra cameras that the police didn't know about, right? And so imagine what it takes, though, to actually mount that kind of a defense. And the question that we really need to be asking ourselves is, why do the facts matter more for people who can afford that, right? And why does someone's community standing matter more in a courtroom when that community is resourced than people who really have close family ties and also economic reliance on each other in a family? Just because those resources are small does not mean that they're any less crucial. In fact, they're often more important to the success of the people. So I guess that's how I think about equity, is a destination that the criminal system is not going to reach, but at least we can be including these considerations.
Great, thank you. And Brianna, obviously equity is something that underlies the Pretrial Fairness Act that the Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice has talked about. What does it mean to the network? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so Equity, in my mind, is about basically trying to achieve the inverse of marginalization. When people are marginalized, they are pushed to the margins. Their experience is not centered and not always considered. And as a result, it is worsened because there's not attention given to um, if there's not attention given to the inequities and the inequalities and the discriminatory realities that they experience. And so to me, equity is turning that on its head and saying we are bringing the people that are pushed to the margins to the center. We're centering their voices, we're centering their experiences, and we're centering our responses on their experiences in order to get better outcomes. That's why, for example, when we came after the money bond system, we pointed out how it disproportionately affected Black people, that Black people were twice as likely to be jailed on an unaffordable money bond, more likely to be given a money bond that was unaffordable and less likely to be able to afford it due to the racial wealth gap. And so when we're talking about money as, oh, people might say, oh, money bond gives people skin in the game. They should have to put up money in order to get out. One, the data doesn't bear that out. But two, what does that mean for people who are affected by the racial wealth gap, affected by racial bias, and having unaffordable money bonds set and more often and less often able to afford it? When you put them at the center, that's when you land on a mission of we just need to get rid of money bond. And you could go down a number of different issues in a number of different situations where the outcomes are worse. I mean, even think about in the court system, how people are rewarded when they have family that can come and be there and stand there for them. I love that people's families are able to come and support them, but I think about the equity implications of that. When someone doesn't have family that can afford to take off work or get the childcare needed to go and stand in court. And so what would it look like to center the people who are on the margins, the people who have no one to show up for them in court? But it doesn't mean they're not loved. It doesn't mean there will be no support for them. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a chance at getting out while awaiting trial. It means equity means pulling back the curtain on every practice and every habit that we're so used to just taking for granted and saying, who is this impacting disproportionately and how can we put them at the center? And when you prioritize better outcomes for the people that are marginalized, you prioritize better outcomes for everyone.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm going to get us back more squarely to funding for Pretrial Fairness Act implementation. So Stephanie, this next question is for you. So there are the requests that we're making as advocates that we've been talking about this evening, but there are also requests for funding being made by law enforcement agencies, other court actors in response to the Pretrial Fairness Act. So for example, law enforcement agencies and courts say that their workload has increased, and counties say that they have this budget gap left by abolishing money bond. So are these needs legitimate, and why should or shouldn't they be prioritized?
Well, I don't know that I can speak to legitimacy of the needs. What I can say is that when we're analyzing what's required, law enforcement is always a policy choice. It's not required that we prosecute and arrest everyone who does everything wrong. In fact, it's impossible, right? And when police encounter law-breaking behavior, they have the choice to not arrest. When prosecutors are referred cases that they don't think are in the interest of justice, they actually have an obligation not to file those charges, but they also can use broad discretion in sort of managing the caseloads that are coming into the courts and deciding what really is worth court resources and time to pursue. And so when resources are running short, they can decide which things to de-emphasize, which things to divert, et cetera. On the other side, the pretrial fairness side, and on the defense side, on the services that people need side, there is actually a right to having a zealous defense. And while the services that we're advocating for in the Pretrial Services Act, sorry, saying it, are not a right, an entitlement. They are something that helps the court and all of the actors in it to obtain better outcomes and operate better. So if what you want to do is have greater efficiency and greater outcomes, then that's an important thing to fund. Defense services are really not an optional thing to fund. And so we have to increase those, as I've talked about. When it comes to law enforcement, I think, any increase in burden to law enforcement agencies brought by maybe additional testifying, I don't really know what other burdens other than the prosecution, obviously spending some more court time on those preliminary hearings. Those are should be offset by a lot of cost savings in jail population, right? And so it's not a direct one-to-one, difference between city budgets, county budgets, state budgets. There's a lot there, but we should be recouping the costs from decreases in jail population, and not only spending them on the needs that are we've talked about in the community, but also it shouldn't be that law enforcement agency budgets necessarily need to increase as a result of the pretrial fairness process.
Got it. So that perfectly set up our next question for Brianna. So in only 7 months, the Pretrial Fairness Act has already begun to reduce the population of people who are jailed pretrial across Illinois. So how should we be using the cost savings associated with this reduction?
Absolutely. I think that, we have said it throughout the night, and I'll gladly say it again. The money should be used to support and bolster the people that have been harmed by the existence of this system for decades. Communities have had to refinance houses, take out second mortgages, sell cars, go without food on the table. Like the things that we have heard and encountered that people have suffered due to the wealth-based incarceration and this level of extraction in our communities is just beyond what most people might think. And so there's no doubt that where there is money saved, that probably shouldn't have been spent on locking all those people up to begin with. It should go back into the communities that have been impacted by incarceration, because incarceration does have economic impacts on communities, right? Like people's ability to earn money, is decreased. Their earnings is decreased statistically. Their likelihood of being unemployed down the line once they've been incarcerated pretrial is increased. And so what does it look like to pour resources back into the community, whether that's I think we haven't talked as much about economic opportunity, but economic opportunity should be in consideration, as well as just the trauma. I mean, even if we just keep it focused on mental and behavioral health, ask any person that has had any level of contact with the legal system, especially any prolonged contact, and they will tell you that it was traumatizing, absolutely traumatizing. Even people that were on electronic monitoring and not in jail, traumatized, because of all of the alerts and the threat of going back to jail because of faulty technology or whatever the case may be. And so what does publicly accessible, affordable or lower no cost mental health look like? What does behavioral addiction is exacerbated by, electronic monitoring and pretrial incarceration? What does substance use treatment? It's all the things we've been talking about. There's no area of someone's life that is not sometimes irreparably damaged by incarceration and entanglement in the legal system. And so the cost savings should absolutely be invested in repair.
Absolutely. So I have one final question for all three of you. I'm going to give you a chance to kind of dream big for a second. So the Pretrial Fairness Act has actually been in effect for exactly 7 months today. So happy 7-month anniversary to the Pretrial Fairness Act. So I'm actually going to ask you to imagine that it is September 18th, 2030, and the Pretrial Fairness Act has been the law in Illinois for 7 years instead of 7 months. What's your vision for what that looks like? And give the audience one thing that they can do to help make that vision a reality. We'll start with you, Stephanie.
Well, I hope that we all have a vision of courts that are slow. because there are not that many people in them. And so that bedrock hope for sure. What I also would like to see in the way of defense is walking into a preliminary hearing and seeing a whole family sitting there with their loved one, seeing the people on that side of the courtroom all know each other, the lawyers, the witnesses, that the people who are accused of a crime have been released, awaiting trial, and that we really have the ability to put some faith in the fact that people are going to get a fair shot, that there's going to be the testing of the evidence that I think we all imagine will happen in a criminal trial, but currently few things are going to trial and pleas are being made where there isn't enough fact available to really get a good understanding. And I guess, so I'm sorry to bring it to such a technical point, but I think in 5 years, it would be good to see that there is a robust, statewide, equitable system of defense that can stand with communities, work with communities, and work with people who are accused of crimes in order to really challenge the evidence presented and make sure that judges are hearing two sides of a story and maybe 3 or 4. And I think in that case, we can expect the outcomes to be better because people will have better access to the things that will really help them to move beyond.
And what's one thing our audience members can do to help us get there?
I would say that we would love to have you help to support the FAIR Act and really push for this statewide system. I'll put some information about it in the chat, and if anybody on this call wants to be connected to that effort, I'm happy to do that. I know a lot of network members are already have already been involved in the coalition, the Speedy Coalition, which has been organized around this, about 60 organizations around the state. And so I really appreciate that. But individuals, organizations who want to get connected to defense, that would be great.
Great, thank you. All right, Lauren, so Pretrial Fairness Act has been law in Illinois for 7 years. What's your vision for what that looks like, and how can our audience help us get there?
I would say that my vision would be a fundamental shift in how our society in Illinois and our communities understand the efficacy and importance of voluntary services. That shift has become so clear because the state has fully funded the Pretrial Success Act, and those robust investments in community-based services are accessible to the people who need them most. And the result is safer and more thriving communities. And while that, I think, may not happen in 7 years, I think in the next 7 years, I hope we are able to see when we invest in these kinds of voluntary services, that there's no question that it's not only the right thing to do, but it's improving the lives of everyone, and it's improving communities everywhere. And that the old system, the money bond system, is a distant memory. And we kind of cringe at ourselves and thinking, I can't believe we ever did that. And more states look to us and they say, we're going to follow that model because we see how important it is to creating a thriving state. And the one thing I would say the audience can do is contact your legislators, tell them to invest $15 million in this, and also remind them how important community-based human services are. So that's what I would say the audience can do.
Thank you. And Brianna, you get the last word. Share your vision and your call to action with the audience.
Yeah, I love what Lauren said about just wanting other states to follow suit. That's truly a dream that, that what is happening in Illinois would truly inspire a tidal wave of change across this country. It is such a draconian practice. We are one of two countries that still rely on wealth-based pretrial jailing. It's us in the Philippines. We should truly be ashamed. And so just that there would be more faith in the possibility of doing something different, something more equitable, something more fair, and that would be chosen over what is familiar. I envision emptier jails. I envision increased empathy in the courtroom and more discretion that is undergirded by empathy. And the Pretrial Fairness Act, you can't legislate heart change, but you can only hope that people will start to treat people who are accused in the legal system like they would want their loved one to be treated, like they would want to treat like they would want their sister or their brother or their cousin or nephew or child to be treated like they would treat somebody that they actually cared about and saw as a human being. And that there would be more diversion and deflection, more, restorative justice, more attempts to achieve justice and healing that is deep and meaningful and responsive to our human desires for reconciliation, not just revenge. And I think what everybody here can do to help us move towards that future is to challenge the narratives of fear of doing something different, fear of redirecting our resources differently than we have before. Because truly we should fear squandering our resources any more than we already have on things that clearly do not serve us and don't serve our communities. We should fear driving full speed ahead in the wrong direction more than we should fear pausing and pivoting and trying something new. And so I hope that people will challenge that narrative in their social circles. I hope that people will use their voices to support the continued, implementation of the Pretrial Fairness Act, the Success Act, and overall just a change in how we conceive of and try to implement justice in our communities.
Great. Thank you so much. I really want to thank Brianna, Lauren, and Stephanie for this. I know that I've gotten so many insightful and frankly inspirational nuggets from this conversation. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt to close us out.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Matt.
Four years into a pandemic and somebody still doesn't know how to do a virtual meeting. All right. Thank you so much to our panelists and presenters for a wonderful and engaging conversation tonight. If you haven't already, I'm dropping a link in the chat where you can download a copy of Investing in Pretrial Justice in Illinois, the new report that we just released today. And if you're feeling inspired from tonight's event, we've got a few upcoming opportunities to get involved. The Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice is hosting a friend bank on April 30th, where we'll teach you how to map out your personal networks and reach out to them and call them to action to get them to contact their legislators about the Pretrial Success Act. We've got a text bank on May 7th, where we'll be sending messages to community members across the state about the Success Act. And then if you live in Chicago, we're going to be getting together live and in person on May 12th at the Logan Square Farmers Market for a community canvas. I just dropped a link in the chat where you can register for any and all of those events. And again, thank you all so much for joining us, and stay tuned to our social media for ways that you can support all of the great things that you heard about tonight. Thanks again, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.